Have you ever felt invisible in your own life? I don't mean in a metaphorical, nobody understands my artistic soul kind of way. I mean truly fundamentally invisible. Like you're a ghost at your own family dinner, a service provider whose only function is to fix things, smooth things over, or write a check. For 32 years, that was my reality. My name is Leo Maxwell, and I was the reliable one, the stable one, the one everyone called when they hit a rough patch. I was the family's resident shock absorber, and frankly, I was worn down to the springs. My life was a repeating cycle of working a demanding but unfulfilling job as an architect's assistant, paying my bills and bracing for the next inevitable phone call from my family. A call that was never just to say hello. It was always a prelude to a problem I was expected to solve. But then, on a rainy Tuesday in October, a different kind of call came. A call from a lawyer with a clipped professional voice who informed me that a man I barely knew, an elderly gentleman from the park named Arthur Pendleton, had passed away, and that he had left me everything. $12 million. I know what you're thinking. It sounds like the opening scene of a feel-good movie. The deserving underdog finally gets his break. But what they don't show you in those movies is the silence that comes after you hang up the phone. The deafening, heart-pounding silence where your entire world tilts on its axis. I sat there in my small one-bedroom apartment, the one I could barely afford in a less than glamorous part of Seattle, and just stared at the wall. The sound of the city rain against my window pane seemed to mock the chaos raging inside my head. $12 million. The number itself felt alien, like a word from a language I didn't speak. Arthur Pendleton. I could see his face so clearly, a kind, wrinkled face with eyes that held a universe of stories he rarely told. We weren't family. We weren't lifelong friends. Our relationship was built on a foundation of shared park benches, lukewarm coffee from my thermos, and quiet conversations about the weather, the changing leaves, and the merits of different types of birdseed. We also played chess. He would beat me soundly every time, but he taught me how to see 3 moves ahead, a lesson I didn't realize at the time would become the most important I'd ever learn. My first instinct after the initial shockwave passed was a jolt of pure, unadulterated joy. A vision of freedom flashed before my eyes. No more 60-hour work weeks drafting someone else's dreams at Sterling and Associates. No more of that sinking feeling in my gut when my boss, a man who saw me as little more than a pair of hands attached to a drafting program, would present my designs as his own. Just last month, I had stayed up for 2 straight nights, reworking the entire HVAC schematic for the new Ellington Tower project. I had found a critical flaw in the senior engineer's calculations, a flaw that would have resulted in catastrophic system failure within the first year of operation. My fix saved the firm millions and its reputation. My reward was a curt nod and an email saying, "Good catch." That was it. My job was to be indispensable and invisible, a combination that grinds you down to dust. This money wasn't just a number. It was an escape hatch from that dust-filled life. It was a new world. And in that moment of euphoria, I did what I was conditioned to do. I picked up the phone to share the news with my family. I wanted them to be happy for me. For once, I wanted to be the one with good news, to be seen as something other than the family ATM and emotional support animal. I should have known better. I should have remembered the last family dinner just a few weeks prior. It was a masterclass in our dysfunction. My older sister Chloe, a sharp corporate lawyer, married to a surgeon, spent the evening detailing their upcoming ski trip to Aspen, her voice dripping with the casual wealth that had become her entire personality. She turned to me at one point, a pitying smile on her face. "So Leo's still drawing those straight lines for Miss Sterling. Have you ever thought about, I don't know, a career with a future?" It was a verbal dagger wrapped in a silk ribbon of feigned concern. My younger brother Ben, a charming drifter who considered serial entrepreneur a viable career path, had cornered me by the kitchen whispering a frantic story about a can't-miss investment in vintage guitars and walked away with $200 I couldn't spare. My father, a retired accountant who lived by the gospel of spreadsheets, gave me his monthly lecture on my underperforming 401 Kelvin, completely oblivious to the fact that my salary left no room for anything beyond rent and ramen. And my mother, the eternal peacemaker, just patted my arm and said, "Well, at least our Leo is stable." Stable. The word they used for predictable. For boring. For the son who would never cause them any real worry, but also never give them anything to brag about. The son who would always be there to pick up the pieces. It was with the desperate, foolish hope of shattering that stable image that I opened our family group chat. The one ironically named Maxwell Clan. I typed out the words, my fingers trembling so much I had to correct 3 typos. "You guys won't believe this. I just inherited $12 million. The response was instantaneous and brutally predictable. Ben was first a string of laughing emojis followed by "LOL, good one, bro. Did you win the imaginary lottery? Anyway, speaking of money, I'm a little short this month." Then came Chloe. Her text was a perfectly crafted piece of condescension. "Leo, that's not funny. People get scammed by things like this all the time. Please don't tell me you gave someone your social security number. I can refer you to a good credit monitoring service if you acted foolishly." My dad the pragmatist, simply replied, "Let's be realistic, son." And my mom, with her gentle conflict-avoidant touch, sent a message that stung the most. "Oh, honey, that's a nice dream. But let's focus on what's real. How are things at work? Did you ever get that squeak in your car fixed?" There it was. My life-altering, world-shattering news dismissed in under 5 minutes as a joke, a scam, a delusion, and a childish dream. They didn't ask a single question. Not who or how or are you okay. Their perception of me was so rigid, so fixed in the amber of my perceived mediocrity, that the idea of me stumbling into a fortune was less believable than me being the victim of a Nigerian prince scam. The joy I had felt just moments before curdled in my stomach, replaced by a familiar, bitter ache. It was the ache of being fundamentally misunderstood by the people who were supposed to know you best. The invisibility cloak was back on heavier than ever. I stared at their messages at the casual, almost cruel way they had swatted my news away like it was a fly buzzing in their ear. And in that moment, a strange, cold resolve settled over me. They called me a liar. They thought I was a fool. Fine, let them. I would go to that lawyer's office. I would claim that inheritance. And I would tell them absolutely nothing. This new life, this incredible gift from a kind stranger who saw more in me during a few games of chess than my family had in 32 years, would be mine and mine alone. The escape hatch had opened, and I was about to climb through it without looking back. But what I didn't realize was that inheriting the money was the easy part. The real challenge would be inheriting a new identity, one that my family would never, ever see coming. This was just the beginning of the story, the first crack in the foundation of my old life. If you want to hear how this unbelievable journey unfolds, and how a secret fortune can expose the truth about the people you love, make sure you hit that like and subscribe button, because what happened next is something you will not want to miss. The day after the phone call felt like walking through a dream, or perhaps more accurately, like being a character in someone else's movie. The first act of my new life was to call in sick to my old one. I told my office I had a sudden splitting migraine, a lie that felt laughably small compared to the tectonic shift occurring beneath the surface of my existence. For the first time in my adult life, I wasn't worried about the consequences of that lie, about falling behind, about looking unreliable, about the disapproving email my boss would inevitably send. The freedom was dizzying and a little terrifying. The lawyer's office was downtown in one of those steel and glass towers that scraped the Seattle sky, the kind of building I usually only saw from the outside while hurrying to my much less impressive office a few blocks away. As I stepped into the hushed, marble-floored lobby, I felt like a complete imposter. I'd consciously chosen my best outfit, a button-down shirt that was only slightly frayed at the collar and a pair of slacks I'd had for 3 years. In my world, this was dressing up. Here, surrounded by men in bespoke suits and women with $1,000 handbags, I might as well have been wearing rags. When I announced myself to the receptionist, she gave me a polite but practiced look of indifference, her eyes flicking over my worn shoes for just a fraction of a second too long. I was Leo Maxwell, the architect's assistant who packed his own lunch and worried about his credit card balance. I was not the kind of person who had an appointment with a senior partner at a prestigious estate law firm like Davies, Albright and Finch. The wait in the plush leather chair felt like an eternity. I could hear my own heart beating a frantic rhythm against the quiet, expensive hum of the office. When a kind-faced older gentleman finally emerged and called my name, I almost didn't stand up. "Mr. Maxwell, I'm Howard Davies. Please come in." His office was exactly what you'd expect. Floor-to-ceiling windows with a panoramic view of Elliott Bay, a mahogany desk the size of a small boat, and leather-bound books that looked like they hadn't been opened in a century. It smelled of old paper, lemon polish, and money. Mr. Davies had a calm, reassuring demeanor that immediately began to chip away at my wall of anxiety. He didn't look at me with suspicion or pity. He just looked professional. He gestured for me to sit, and the leather chair sighed as I sank into it. "Mr. Maxwell," he began, folding his hands on the polished desk. "Thank you for coming in. I was the legal counsel for Arthur Pendleton for over 20 years. I must say his final instructions were quite specific and a little surprising even to me." He slid a thick, leather-bound portfolio across the desk. The weight of it felt substantial, real. "This is a copy of his last will and testament. It is, I assure you, ironclad. After a few small bequests to his longtime housekeeper and a generous donation to the City Parks Department, the entirety of his remaining estate, valued at approximately $12.4 million after taxes, is left you." He said it so matter-of-factly as if he were discussing the weather. I opened the portfolio with trembling hands. And there it was, in crisp legal jargon that swam before my eyes, my full name, Leo Alexander Maxwell, my address and a number with so many zeros it seemed to vibrate on the page. It was real. The sheer undeniable reality of it hit me like a physical blow. "Why?" The word escaped my lips, a raw, involuntary whisper. "Why me? I barely knew him." Mr. Davies gave me a small, sympathetic smile. Arthur was a very private man. He never explained his reasoning to me in detail. He simply said, and I am quoting from my notes of our last meeting, "Leo is a good young man. He sees the world for what it is not, for what he can get from it. He knows the value of a quiet moment. He amended his will about 6 months ago. It was all very clear, very deliberate. A good young man. He knows the value of a quiet moment." The simple words landed with more force than the dollar amount. Arthur had seen me. In a world where I felt like a ghost, this quiet, elderly man I shared a park bench with had actually seen me for who I was. He hadn't seen the stable, boring, pushover son. He'd seen someone who appreciated quiet moments, maybe because my life was so devoid of them. Tears pricked at the corners of my eyes, and I looked out at the gray waters of the bay to hide them. This wasn't just money. It was validation. It was the most profound act of recognition I had ever experienced in my entire life. We spent the next 2 hours wading through a sea of logistics. Trusts, tax implications, investment advisors, philanthropic vehicles. My head swam with information I could barely process. Mr. Davies explained the concept of a blind trust, a legal structure that would allow me to manage the funds without my name being publicly attached to them. As he spoke, the genius of my family's disbelief became clear. Their scorn, which had been so painful, was now an incredible gift. It was a shield, a protective cloak of invisibility that would give me time. Time to think, to plan, to become the person who could handle this new reality before they inevitably found out and tried to tear it apart. When I finally left the office, clutching a heavy leather briefcase full of documents, I walked out into the cold Seattle drizzle, not as Leo the assistant, but as Leo the multimillionaire. The city looked different. The people rushing by the cars, splashing through puddles, the gray sky. It was all the same, but I was different. The weight of financial anxiety, a permanent resident on my shoulders since I was a teenager, was just gone. It was like a phantom limb. I kept mentally reaching for the familiar stress, the constant, low-level panic about bills, but there was nothing there. In its place was a vast, terrifying, exhilarating expanse of pure possibility. That evening, back in my apartment, the legal documents spread across my cheap IKEA coffee table looked absurdly out of place. The contrast was a perfect metaphor for my life, a $12 million reality crammed into a $50,000 a year existence. The secret was a heavy one. I had never kept anything this monumental from my family before. Despite our dysfunctional dynamic, we were still connected by a web of shared history and obligation, and as the reality of my new life began to sink in, so did a profound sense of loneliness. I had this incredible world-changing secret, and the one person I could have shared it with, the one person who had made it all possible, was gone. I found myself thinking more and more about Arthur. Who was he really, beyond the quiet man on the park bench? What was his life like? Did he have a family, a wife, children? Why was a man of such means spending his afternoons playing chess with a stranger? I felt an overwhelming need to understand the why on a deeper, more human level. It was as if I couldn't truly accept the gift until I understood the giver. It wasn't about the money anymore. It was about the man. The next morning I called Miss Davies with a strange request, one I was sure he'd find odd. "Mr. Davies," I began, "I know this is unusual, but did Arthur leave behind any personal effects, journals, photographs, anything that wasn't designated for donation? I feel like I need to understand him better." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I thought I had overstepped, that I was prying into a life that wasn't mine. But when Mr. Davies finally spoke, his voice held a new note of warmth, almost of approval. "As a matter of fact, he did," he said slowly. "He left a single sealed box with a note addressed to you. His instructions were very specific. He told me to give it to you only if you asked about him, not about the money. He thought you might. It's here at the office waiting for you." The box was deceptively ordinary. It was a simple cardboard banker's box, the kind you see stacked in dusty office storage rooms, sealed with a single thick strip of yellowing packing tape. My name, Leo, was written on the top in a shaky but surprisingly elegant cursive that spoke of a bygone era when penmanship was an art form. It felt heavier than it should have, not just with the physical weight of its contents, but with the intangible weight of a life I knew almost nothing about. I carried it back to my apartment with a reverence I usually reserved for fragile architectural models. I set it on my small dining table, the same table where I ate my solitary meals and agonized over my monthly budget. For a full hour, I just stared at it, a strange mix of reverence and trepidation swirling inside me. Opening this box felt like a more significant and irreversible act than signing the legal documents. The documents were about money, a concept that was still abstract and unreal. This box was about a person. It was the key to understanding the why, and a part of me was terrified of what that answer might be. What if I didn't deserve it? What if it was all a mistake? Finally summoning a courage I didn't know I possessed, I took a deep breath, slit the tape with a kitchen knife, and lifted the lid. The air that rose from the box smelled of old paper leather, and something faintly like dried lavender. It was the scent of preserved memories. The first thing I saw was a collection of old, leather-bound journals stacked neatly in chronological order. There were at least a dozen of them, their covers worn smooth with time, their pages brittle and brown at the edges. Beneath them lay thick stacks of black and white photographs, the old kind with scalloped edges held together with rubber bands that had grown hard and cracked with age. There was also a small worn velvet pouch that clinked softly when I touched it, and a few miscellaneous items, a tarnished silver baby rattle, a faded orchestra ticket stub from a 1965 performance of La Bohème, and a small, intricately carved wooden bird. At the very bottom, lying flat, was a single sealed envelope of heavy, cream-colored stationery. The same elegant, shaky cursive on the front for Leo. I knew instinctively that the letter had to be last. It was the epilogue. I needed to read the story first. I picked up the top journal. The date on the first page, written in crisp, confident ink, was the 5th of September 1968. Arthur would have been a young man then, around my age. His handwriting was strong and clear, filled with the boundless optimism of youth. I opened it and fell headfirst into his world. I spent the next several hours, which bled from late afternoon into the deep of night, completely lost. I read about his college days at Columbia, where he studied literature with a fierce passion, his dreams of becoming a novelist, of writing the next great American story. I read about his whirlwind romance with a woman named Eleanor, a fiery art history major who he described with such vivid, loving detail that I felt I could see her smile, hear her laugh. Eleanor doesn't just look at a painting, he wrote. She inhabits it. She finds the story hidden in every brushstroke. Today she made me see a Rothko not as blocks of color but as a doorway into a silent, screaming heart. She is teaching me how to see. The photographs brought his words to life. There was Arthur, young and impossibly handsome in a tweed jacket, his hair slicked back, his arm wrapped tightly around a beautiful woman with sparkling, intelligent eyes, Eleanor. There were photos of their small, joyful wedding in a city hall, of their first tiny apartment in Greenwich Village, of a beat-up Ford Falcon he was so proud of. It was a life built not on wealth but on a shared passion for art, books, and each other. It was a life full of love and simple, profound joys. As I moved through the journals, the years flew by. I read about the birth of their son Thomas. Arthur's entries from this period were ecstatic, almost holy in their reverence. I held my son for the first time today, he wrote. All my ambitions, all my novels, they are dust compared to this. His tiny hand wrapped around my finger, and I understood for the first time the true meaning of creation. He had given up his dream of writing to take a steady, soul-crushing job in the mailroom of a large insurance company to support his new family. He wrote about the monotonous work, the fluorescent lights, the feeling of his soul shrinking a little each day. But he wrote about it with no trace of regret. His family, his Eleanor, and his Thomas was his masterpiece. The photographs from this time were filled with a warm, sepia-toned light, a young boy with Arthur's kind eyes and Eleanor's bright, mischievous smile, riding a tricycle on a sun-dappled sidewalk, flying a kite on a wind-swept beach, blowing out candles on a birthday cake. They were the picture of a happy, idyllic American family. It was beautiful, but it also deepened the mystery that was now a palpable presence in my quiet apartment. This was a man who had a family, a son he adored beyond measure. What had happened to them? Where was Thomas now? Why had Arthur been so utterly alone in the end? His vast fortune left to me a stranger from a park bench and not to his own blood. The tone of the journals began to shift almost imperceptibly. In the mid-1982nd, the entries became shorter, more sporadic. The joyful, flowing descriptions of family life were replaced by a quiet, gnawing anxiety. Thomas, then, a teenager, was becoming rebellious. He was brilliant and artistic, a painter with a talent that Arthur described with a mixture of pride and terror. But he was also headstrong and defiant. Arthur wrote about arguments about his son's frustration with their quiet, suburban life, a life Arthur had chosen for its stability. He wrote about Thomas's dreams of moving to New York to become a painter, dreams that Arthur, the pragmatic insurance man who had climbed his way up to a senior executive position, couldn't understand. He saw the art world as a path to poverty and heartbreak, the very things he had worked his entire life to shield his family from. The more he pushed his son towards a conventional career, business, law, anything safe, the more Thomas pulled away. "He looks at me," Arthur wrote, "and I see the same look of pity I once reserved for my own father. He sees a man who sold his soul for a mortgage." Eleanor, it seemed, was the fragile bridge between them, trying to broker a peace that never lasted. The last happy photograph in the stack was from Thomas's high school graduation. The three of them stood together, smiling, but there was a tension in their poses, a distance between father and son that the camera couldn't hide. After that, the family photos stopped. The journals from the 1992nd were filled with a profound, heartbreaking sadness. Thomas had left for New York at 19, after a terrible fight with Arthur over his refusal to enroll in college. The communication dwindled from tense, infrequent phone calls to holiday cards, and then to nothing at all. Arthur wrote of his regret of his stubborn pride that kept him from picking up the phone and just telling his son he loved him, that he was proud of him. Then came the entry that made me gasp. It was a short, blotchy, almost illegible paragraph dated in the winter of 1995. Eleanor had been killed. A drunk driver had run a red light. Arthur wrote that the light had gone out of his world. He was alone now, with only his guilt and a son who was a stranger to him. He had tried desperately to find Thomas to tell him about his mother's death, even hiring a private investigator, but Thomas had vanished into the sprawling anonymity of New York City's art scene. The journals stopped for nearly a decade after that. When they picked up again in the mid-2002nd, the handwriting was the shaky cursive I recognized. The entries were filled with the quiet, aching melancholy of an old man living with his ghosts. He had retired, sold the family home that was too full of memories, and moved to the city. He wrote about his days, his routines, the feeling of being a relic in a fast-moving world. And then about a year before he passed, he wrote about me. "A young man sat on the bench with me today," the entry began. "His name is Leo. There is a gentleness in his eyes, but also a deep weariness, a quiet patience. He works too hard, I can tell. He carries a weight on his shoulders that is not his own." He wrote about our conversations, small details I had long forgotten. He wrote about our chess games. "He plays a defensive game," Arthur noted, "always protecting his king, even at the cost of his queen. A man conditioned to absorb blows rather than deliver them." He wrote about how I reminded him of someone. I flipped through the last few pages, my heart pounding, and there it was. Tucked into a small pocket on the inside back cover of the final journal was a single faded Polaroid I hadn't seen before. It was a picture of his son Thomas, taken shortly before he left for New York. He was maybe 18, with a shy smile, unruly brown hair, and kind, thoughtful eyes that held a hint of sadness. I stared at the picture, a cold dread washing over me. It was like looking in a mirror. The resemblance wasn't just passing. It was uncanny. The shape of the face, the set of the eyes, the way he held his head. We could have been brothers. My mind reeled trying to process the impossible. Was this it? Was this the why? Did he leave me his fortune because I looked like the son he had lost? The idea was both flattering and deeply unsettling. Was I just a stand-in, a proxy for a ghost? I felt a sudden, desperate need to read his final letter. My hands shook as I picked up the sealed envelope. This letter held the final piece of the puzzle, and I knew with absolute certainty that whatever it said would change everything. The crisp, heavy paper of the envelope felt like a sacred artifact in my hands as I carried it over to my worn armchair by the window. The city lights had begun to flicker on, casting long dancing shadows across my small living room. The apartment, which had once felt like a cozy sanctuary from the world, now felt like a holding cell trapping me with the ghosts of Arthur Pendleton's past. The journals and photographs were spread across my dining table, like an archaeological dig, a life laid bare. For a moment I was tempted to put the letter away to leave the final mystery unsolved. Knowing that I was a doppelganger for his long-lost son was already a heavy, complicated burden. What if the letter confirmed my worst fear, that I was nothing more than a vessel for his grief, a convenient face on which to project a lifetime of regret? Was I just the final move in a chess game he had been playing against himself for decades? The thought was chilling. But I knew I couldn't move forward without knowing the whole truth. My inheritance, my entire future, was inextricably linked to this man's past. I owed it to him, and more importantly, I owed it to myself to understand. With a final deep breath that did little to calm my racing heart, I broke the seal. The letter was written on thick, creamy stationery, the kind of paper people don't use anymore, and it was dated just 3 weeks before his death. Arthur's cursive was just as I remembered from the box, lid shaky with age but deliberate, and full of a character that technology has all but erased from the world. "My dearest Leo," it began, and the simple, affectionate address made my throat tighten. "If you are reading this, it means 2 things. First, that I am gone. I hope my passing was peaceful. Second, and more importantly, it means that you had the curiosity and the kindness to ask about the old man you shared your coffee and your time with. For that alone, I am already grateful beyond words. I know you must be consumed by a single burning question. Why? Why you, I imagine, my lawyer, Mr. Davies, a good and loyal man, but one who lacks a certain poetry, gave you the simple answer I provided him. But you, Leo, you deserve more than that. You deserve the truth in all its messy, complicated glory. Yes, it is true that the first time I saw you sitting on that park bench, my old, tired heart stopped for a beat. The resemblance to my Thomas, my dear lost boy, is nothing short of extraordinary. It was like seeing a ghost in the autumn Sunday. For the first few weeks of our acquaintance, I will admit my motives were entirely selfish. I wanted to be near you because it felt like a second chance. A chance to have the conversations I never had with him. A chance to listen, truly listen, in a way I so tragically failed to do when he needed me most. I was a proud and foolish man, Leo. A man terrified of the world's uncertainties. I loved my son more than life itself, but I was terrified of his dreams because they were not my own. I saw his passion for art not as a gift, but as a liability. I pushed him towards a life of stability and security, believing with all my heart that it was for his own good, but I was deaf to the language of his soul. He was an artist, and I tried to make him an accountant. It was a mistake that cost me my wife's happiness, my son's love, and ultimately my own soul. It is a debt I can never repay. I had to pause, my vision blurring. I thought of my own life, of my father, the pragmatist who always subtly questioned my career path, who saw my work as a respectable hobby rather than a true profession. I thought of Chloe's condescending remarks. The parallels were unnerving, a painful echo across generations. I wiped my eyes and continued reading. But as the weeks turned into months and our silent companionship blossomed into a quiet friendship, something changed. I began to see you not as a reflection of my son, but as your own person. I heard the deep, unspoken weariness in your voice when you spoke of your job. I saw the quiet generosity in the way you always offered me the first cup of coffee from your thermos, even on the coldest mornings. And I listened perhaps for the first time in my life without judgment, without an agenda. I heard the stories you told often reluctantly about your family. About your sister, the high achiever who uses her success as a weapon. About your parents who seem to love you but do not seem to understand you in the slightest. And about your younger brother, the one who is a constant source of trouble, the one you are always, always rescuing. I saw in you the same burden I saw in my dear Eleanor, the thankless, draining role of the family peacemaker, the shock absorber, the one who absorbs everyone else's problems and is left with no one to help with their own. I saw a young man with a good, kind heart slowly being crushed by the weight of unearned obligations, and in that Leo I saw a different kind of second chance. Not for me, but for you. My money could not bring my son back. It could not undo my decades of mistakes or fill the cavern of my regret. For years, my fortune has been nothing but a monument to my failure, a cold and useless pile of numbers. But in your hands, I hoped it could become something else. It could become freedom. A chance for you to live a life on your own terms, not one dictated by the needs and expectations of others. A chance to build your own dreams, not just draft them for someone else. Do not let your family's small vision of you define the boundaries of your life. They see you as stable. I see you as shackled. This money is the key. Please, for my sake and for yours, use it. The letter fell from my hands onto the floor. It wasn't about his son. Not really. It was about me. He had seen the invisible cage I was living in, a cage so familiar. I had stopped even noticing the bars, and he had handed me the key. The validation was so overwhelming, so pure, that it felt like a physical force washing away years of self-doubt and quiet desperation. He hadn't seen me as a ghost. He had seen me more clearly than anyone in my entire life. Just as I was absorbing the full, staggering weight of his words, my phone buzzed violently on the table, shattering the sacred silence of the room. The caller ID flashed Ben. Of course. My younger brother had a sixth sense for calling at the most inopportune moments, a heat-seeking missile for any flicker of peace in my life. A part of me, the new part that was just beginning to form, wanted to ignore it, to let it go to voicemail, to stay in this bubble of quiet revelation. But 32 years of conditioning is a powerful force. I was the fixer. I was the shock absorber. I answered the phone. Leo, hey man, thank God you picked up. His voice was a frantic, high-pitched whine of panic that I knew all too well. It was the voice he used when the consequences he'd been outrunning had finally caught up to him. I'm in some serious trouble, bro. Like serious. What is it this time, Ben? I asked. My voice flat, drained of all emotion, a stark contrast to his hysteria. Okay, so you know that investment opportunity I told you about, the crypto thing, the one with the guaranteed returns? I sighed, a long, weary exhalation of breath. The one I told you was a textbook Ponzi scheme. Yeah, well, it wasn't exactly a scam, more of a temporary market downturn. He stammered the words, tumbling over each other. The point is, the guys I borrowed the initial stake from, they're not very patient. They think I lost their money, which I technically did, and they want it back. Like tonight. My blood ran cold. This felt different from his usual landlord or credit card troubles. Borrowed from who, Ben? This isn't another maxed-out Visa, is it? There was a pause on the other end, and I could hear his shaky breath. Not exactly, he whispered. They're not. Bankers. They're the kind of guys who hold their meetings in the back of warehouses. Look, Leo, I messed up bad. They said if I don't have $20,000 by midnight, they're going to. They're going to break my legs. I'm not kidding, man. I saw what they did to another guy. I'm hiding in a bathroom right now. You're the only one I can call. $20,000. The number was simultaneously astronomical and horrifyingly completely insignificant to me now. A week ago, it would have been an impossible life-destroying sum. Now it was 0.16% of my net worth. A rounding error. But it wasn't about the money. It was about the pattern. It was about Arthur's letter, his last will and testament for my life, lying on the floor beside me. The one you are always rescuing. Here it was. The first test. Ben didn't believe I had the money. He still thought my inheritance was a joke. He was calling me out of pure, desperate habit, assuming I would perform my usual function, sell a stock I didn't have, take out a loan against my already strained credit, destroy my own stability to patch the latest hole in his sinking ship. He saw me as his safety net. He didn't see me at all. "Leo, are you there? Please, man, say something." His voice cracked with a desperation that was either real or a masterful performance. With Ben, it was always impossible to tell. I stood up and walked to the window looking down at the anonymous city streets below. I held the phone to my ear, the weight of 2 lives in my hand, the life Arthur had given me, and the life my family expected of me. I could give Ben the money. It would be easy. I could wire it anonymously, solve his problem, and he'd be none the wiser. The fixer in me, the older brother, screamed to do it, to smooth things over, to protect him from his own stupidity. But Arthur's letter was a silent, powerful counter-argument, a path of freedom, a path that required me to stop being their shock absorber. For the first time in my life, I had to choose not what they needed from me, but what I needed for myself. "I can't help you, Ben," I said, my voice barely a whisper, but as steady and solid as a stone foundation. The silence on the other end of the line was more terrifying than his panic had ever been. "What? What did you say?" Ben's voice was a ragged whisper of disbelief, as if he'd misheard me, as if the words I'd spoken were a language he didn't understand. In a way, they were. The concept of me saying no to him in a moment of crisis was so alien, so completely outside the established rules of our relationship, that his brain simply couldn't process it. "I said I can't help you," I repeated, my voice stronger this time, drawing on a well of resolve I didn't know I possessed. I gripped the phone tighter, my knuckles white, anchoring myself against the coming storm. "I don't have $20,000, Ben. And even if I did, I can't keep doing this. I can't keep being your emergency exit." "You don't have it. What the hell is that supposed to mean?" He spat back, the initial shock now rapidly curdling into a familiar, petulant rage. "What about all that inheritance crap you were spouting in the group chat, the $12 million? Or was that just a big fat lie to get some attention because your life is so pathetic?" There it was. The accusation thrown back in my face at the moment of his greatest need. He didn't believe me, and yet he still felt entitled to the fictional money he was accusing me of inventing. The twisted logic was so perfectly Ben, so perfectly my family. The irony was so thick it was suffocating. "It doesn't matter if it was real or not, Ben," I said, trying to keep my voice calm, and even channeling the quiet dignity of Arthur. "The answer is no." "You liar, you selfish bastard," he screamed into the phone, his voice echoing tinny and distorted the acoustics of the bathroom he was hiding in, amplifying his fury. "My life is on the line and you're cutting me off. After everything I've done for you," I almost laughed, a bitter, hollow sound that was more of a cough than a laugh. "Everything you've done for me. What have you ever done for me, Ben? Besides drain my bank account, add a decade of stress to my life, and borrow my favorite guitar and never return it. I'm your brother," he roared, falling back on the one argument he always used, the one that had always been his trump card. That's supposed to mean something. It's supposed to be unconditional. It's supposed to, I said quietly, the fight draining out of me replaced by a profound, bone-deep sadness. But it has to go both ways. It can't just be a one-way street of obligation, Ben. That's not love. It's exploitation. I could hear shouting in the background on his end, muffled in angry voices. His time, whether real or fabricated, was running out. Look, Ben, I can't give you money, I said, making a split-second decision that felt both compassionate and firm. But I will call the police for you. Right now. I'll give them your location. I'll tell them you're being threatened by loan sharks. They can get you out of there safely. They can help you. The cops! Are you insane? He shrieked, his voice cracking with a new kind of panic. That'll just make things 1,000 times worse. These guys will kill me. I don't need the cops. I need cash. From my brother. He was right, of course. Calling the police on men like that was a terrible idea, one that could get him seriously hurt. But my offer wasn't really about that. It was a test. A person in genuine fear for their life would consider any port in a storm. A person trying to manipulate a situation would reject any solution that didn't involve a cash payment. His reaction told me everything I needed to know. Then I'm sorry. I really am. But I can't help you with money, I said. And before he could scream at me again, before my own hard-won resolve could crumble under the weight of 32 years of guilt, I ended the call. My hand was shaking as I lowered the phone. I slid down the wall and sat on the floor, my head in my hands. My heart was pounding a frantic drumbeat of guilt and fear. Had I just signed my brother's death warrant, visions of a darkened alley of shadowy figures and a brutal, senseless act of violence flashed through my mind. The old Leo, the fixer, the shock absorber, was screaming at me from inside my own head, calling me a monster, a sociopath. I had the power to save him with a simple, painless wire transfer, and I had refused. It felt like a betrayal of the deepest, most primal bond. I was a terrible brother. I was a terrible person. But then Arthur's words, his quiet wisdom, settled over my panic like a cool, weighted blanket. A chance for you to live a life on your own terms. This was the cost of that life. It wasn't just about enjoying the freedom. It was about defending it. It was about setting boundaries that were decades overdue. It was about understanding that helping someone and enabling them were two very different and often opposing things. For years, my help had been a crutch for Ben, allowing him to be reckless and irresponsible without ever facing the true painful consequences of his actions. My money had never solved his problems. It had only postponed them, making the next crisis even bigger. I spent the rest of the night in a state of agonizing limbo, staring at my silent phone, expecting a call from a hospital or the police or my hysterical mother. Every siren that wailed in the distance made me jump out of my skin. But the call never came. Morning arrived with a gray, indifferent light, and I felt hollowed out as if I'd been physically beaten. I hadn't slept. I just sat and waited and wrestled with the guilt. Around 9 a.m., my phone buzzed. It was a text from my mom. My heart seized. This was it, the bad news. I fumbled with the phone, my hands slick with sweat. But the text didn't say what I feared. It said, "Ben is at our house. He is very upset with you, Leo. He said you abandoned him when his life was in danger. We need to have a serious family talk about your behavior. He was safe." The relief was so immense, so total, that it almost brought me to my knees. The threats, the midnight deadline, the men in the warehouse, it had all been a bluff. A dramatic, high-stakes manipulation, and I had, for the first time in my entire life, refused to play my part. He hadn't needed $20,000 to save his life. He had wanted $20,000 to cover his gambling losses, and he had used the most extreme emotional blackmail he could conjure to get it. And it had almost worked. The fallout was immediate and nuclear. Later that day, my father called. His voice was cold, heavy, with a disappointment so profound it felt like a physical weight coming through the phone. "Your mother told me what happened with Ben," he said, skipping any pleasantries. "I don't know what's gotten into you, Leo. He's your brother. We are a family. You don't turn your back on family." "Did he tell you what the money was for?" I asked, my voice raw from exhaustion. "Did he tell you he'd been threatened by loan sharks because he got into a crypto scam?" "He said it was a misunderstanding that he got in over his head," my father replied dismissively, completely missing the point. "The point is he came to you for help in desperation and you refused. That's not how we raised you." "You raised me to be responsible," I shot back, a new fire in my voice fueled by righteous indignation. "You raised me to work hard and live within my means. Ben does none of those things, and I'm tired of being the one who pays for it." "Why didn't you give him the money, Dad? You're retired, you have a comfortable pension. You sent him money the next day." He scoffed, a sound of pure derision. "Don't be ridiculous. Your mother and I need that for our retirement. It would be financially irresponsible to throw it away on one of Ben's schemes." The hypocrisy was so blatant, so utterly shameless that it left me speechless. It was irresponsible for him to risk his own money, but it was my familial duty to risk mine. I was the designated safety net, and I had just ripped a hole in it. The conversation ended with him telling me he was deeply disappointed in my character. An hour later, my sister Chloe called. Her tone was less emotional, more clinical, like a surgeon examining a diseased organ. "I heard about the drama with Ben," she said, her voice dripping with the weary condescension of an adult dealing with two squabbling children. "Honestly, Leo, what were you thinking? You know how he gets. You should have just given him a little something to calm him down. Now Mom's a wreck and Dad's furious. You've created a huge mess for everyone." "I created the mess?" I asked, incredulous. "Ben is the one who got involved with loan sharks and lied about it. Allegedly," she said, the lawyer in her kicking in automatically. "Look, this is about managing the situation. You've always been the one to keep things stable. This isn't like you. First, this bizarre fantasy about inheriting a fortune, and now this. Are you okay? Are you having some kind of breakdown? Dad and I are genuinely concerned." They had twisted the narrative completely. In their universe, I wasn't the victim of years of financial and emotional exploitation. I was the one who had suddenly become unstable, selfish, and cruel. Ben, the source of the chaos, was repositioned as the victim of my newfound coldness. They weren't angry that Ben was in trouble. They were angry that I was no longer willing to be the solution. I was disrupting the system, and the system was pushing back hard. As I hung up the phone after Chloe's clinical dissection of my failings, I felt a strange sense of clarity amidst the pain. The ache of their judgment was still there, a dull throb in my chest. But for the first time, it was outweighed by a sense of rightness. I had drawn a line in the sand. I had protected myself. I looked at the box from Arthur at his letter, and I knew I had honored his gift. He had given me freedom, and I had just survived my first brutal attempt to be dragged back into the cage. The battle was over, but I knew the war for my own autonomy had just begun. The weeks following the Ben incident were defined by a chilling, strategic silence from my family. The usual stream of trivial texts in the group chat, photos of Chloe's prize-winning roses, links to articles from my dad on Roth IRAs, goofy memes from Ben dried up completely. My mom's daily just checking in calls, the ones I used to find smothering but now recognized as a form of maternal surveillance, ceased. It was a strategic, coordinated freeze-out, a classic tactic from their playbook designed to make me feel isolated and consumed by guilt. The goal was to make the silence so uncomfortable that I would come crawling back, apology in hand, ready to resume my designated role as the family's financial and emotional ballast. In the past, this would have destroyed me. The fear of their collective disapproval had been the silent, powerful motivator for most of my life. I would have lasted 3 days, maybe 4, before breaking down and calling my mom begging for forgiveness I didn't need for a crime I hadn't committed. But now things were different. Their silence wasn't a punishment. It was a gift. It was a quiet, expansive space where I could finally start to breathe and think about my own future free from the constant buzzing hum of their needs and expectations. Arthur's money had bought me a fortress of financial independence, and my family's disapproval was the unexpected moat surrounding it, keeping them at a safe distance. And I had a lot to think about. My first major decision was about my job. For 12 long years, I had poured my heart and soul into my work at Sterling and Associates. I respected my boss, Mr. Sterling, as a brilliant architect, but as a manager, he was a vampire who fed on the creativity of his underlings. I was perpetually underpaid and systemically undervalued my name, never appearing on the final designs, my contributions relegated to the footnotes of a project's history. I was the reliable workhorse who stayed late, fixed the mistakes of the senior staff, and never got the credit for the firm's most innovative concepts, many of which originated from my late-night sketches on discarded blueprint paper. Arthur's gift wasn't just about not having to work. It was about having the freedom to do work that mattered, to create something that was entirely my own. I started thinking about his son Thomas, the artist who was pushed towards a life of practicality and suffocated. I thought about the community art classes I used to take in college, the pure, unadulterated joy I felt with a piece of charcoal in my hand, a joy I had packed away like a childish toy in favor of a stable career. 2 weeks to the day after my last conversation with my family, I walked into Mr. Sterling's glass-walled office. I gave him my 2 weeks' notice. He was stunned into a rare moment of speechlessness. "Leo, is everything all right?" he finally managed, taking off his expensive minimalist glasses. "Is it another firm? Did they offer you more money? Because whatever it is, we can match it. You're a valuable asset to this firm." A valuable asset. Not a valuable person or a talented architect. An asset. The offer to match any competing salary was the final bitter insult. It was an admission that they had been knowingly underpaying me for years. If they could suddenly afford to pay me more, they could have been doing it all along. The realization didn't make me angry. It just made me sad for the man I used to be, the one who had accepted their valuation of him for so long. "No, sir," I said politely, my voice steady. "It's not another firm. I'm just moving in a new direction. I'm going to take some time off to pursue my own creative projects." He looked at me with a mixture of pity and utter confusion, the same way my family did. He saw my decision not as a calculated step towards a new life, but as a reckless, youthful folly. In his mind, I was having the same breakdown my sister had diagnosed, throwing away a perfectly good, if uninspired, career. The final 2 weeks were painfully awkward. My colleagues treated me like a terminal patient, speaking in hushed tones when I walked by. But on my last day, as I packed my few personal belongings into a cardboard box, an overwhelming sense of liberation washed over me. I walked out of that building for the last time, not into the terrifying abyss of unemployment, but into the bright, open territory of self-ownership. My next step was to address my living situation. My small, cramped apartment, once my only sanctuary, now felt like a relic of my old life, a physical manifestation of my former limitations. The thin walls that carried my neighbors' arguments, the persistent scent of damp from a leaky pipe the landlord refused to fix, the constant worry about the next rent increase. I was done with it. I engaged a high-end realtor, a discreet professional recommended by Mr. Davies, and began the surreal process of house hunting as a cash buyer. I wasn't looking for a sterile, ostentatious mansion like my sister's. I didn't want a monument to wealth designed to impress people I didn't like. I wanted a home, a place with character, with history, with light. Most importantly, I wanted a space for a real studio, a room where I could make a mess and create without constraint. I found it in a converted warehouse loft in the Georgetown neighborhood, a place where the city's industrial past met its artistic present. It had soaring 20-foot ceilings, exposed brick walls that still bore the faint traces of old advertisements, and huge multi-paned industrial windows that flooded the cavernous space with the soft gray, ethereal light that is unique to Seattle. It was more expensive than anything I could have ever dreamed of, but the purchase was a simple, clean, straightforward transaction. No mortgage applications, no agonizing over interest rates, no begging the bank for approval. Just a quiet purchase made through the anonymous trust Mr. Davies had established. These changes, while monumental to me, were still invisible to my family. As far as they knew, I was an unemployed architect's assistant having a mental health crisis, probably living on credit card debt, and rapidly approaching rock bottom. But eventually the silence had to break. It happened as these things so often do at an obligatory family event, my mom's 60th birthday dinner. Avoiding it would have been an act of war, escalating our Cold War into a full-blown conflict. I walked into the restaurant, a place Chloe had chosen, of course unnecessarily expensive and obnoxiously trendy, and the temperature in the room dropped by 20 degrees. My mom gave me a tight, strained hug that felt more like a hostage exchange. My dad offered a curt nod, his jaw tight with disapproval. Ben wouldn't even look at me, focusing intently on his phone as if it contained the secrets of the universe. Chloe watched me with the keen, analytical eyes of a hawk, her lawyer's mind, assessing every detail of my appearance. So Leo, my dad, started once. We were all seated, his fork hovering over his appetizer. "How's the job hunt going?" The question was a loaded weapon designed to sound concerned while actually being an accusation, a public shaming. "Actually, I'm not looking for a job," I said, calmly, taking a slow, deliberate sip of water. "I'm taking a sabbatical to focus on my own art." Ben snorted into his napkin, a loud, derisive sound. "A sabbatical. From what being broke, Ben? Be nice," my mom murmured, though her eyes were pleading with me, not with him, not to cause a scene. "No, it's a fair question," Chloe interjected, leaning forward, her eyes glittering with malice. "How exactly are you affording a sabbatical, Leo? Did your imaginary inheritance finally come through?" The table fell silent. This was the moment they had all been waiting for. The public cross-examination. They thought they had me cornered. The unemployed, delusional brother who had abandoned his family and was now living in a fantasy world, about to be exposed and humiliated. "Something like that," I said, a small, knowing smile playing on my lips. I refused to give them the satisfaction of an argument. I would not justify, I would not explain, I would not defend. It was the new me. The me that didn't require their approval to exist. My unexpected calm, my refusal to be baited, seemed to unnerve them more than any angry outburst would have. Chloe in particular looked suspicious. Her lawyer's brain was whirring, trying to make sense of the pieces that didn't fit. I wasn't acting like someone who was unemployed and desperate. I wasn't anxious or defensive. I was content. And for my family, my contentment, independent of their validation or control, was the most confusing and threatening thing of all. The rest of the dinner was painfully tense. The conversation was stilted, full of brittle small talk that danced around the giant multi-million-dollar elephant in the room. But as we were leaving, Chloe pulled me aside near the coat check, her grip on my arm surprisingly strong. "I don't know what your game is, Leo," she said, her voice low and intense, her eyes boring into mine. "But something's going on. I did a public records search. Your old apartment building. Your unit was sold 2 weeks ago. For cash. For a price that's more than you've earned in your entire life. It was sold to a trust. An anonymous trust." My blood ran cold for a second, a flicker of panic, but I kept my expression neutral. I had underestimated her. Of course she would do her due diligence. She was a lawyer and a deeply suspicious person. It's what she did. That's interesting, I said, shrugging noncommittally. Maybe I have a very generous landlord. She narrowed her eyes, her face hardening. Don't play dumb with me. And that name you mentioned, the one who supposedly left you the money? Arthur Pendleton? I simply nodded. There was an Arthur Pendleton who died recently. A very wealthy, very reclusive insurance magnate. His death was mentioned in the financial pages of the Wall Street Journal. It's all public record if you know where to look. She had me. She had connected the dots. The disbelief that had been my shield for weeks was beginning to crumble under the force of her relentless, suspicious nature. But as I looked at her face illuminated by the cold light of the restaurant's foyer, I didn't see a sister who was about to be happy for her brother's incredible good fortune. I saw a predator who had just caught the scent of blood in the water. The game was changing. My family's disbelief was no longer a dismissive joke. It was transforming into a hungry, dangerous, and calculating suspicion. And I knew with a sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach that things were about to get much, much worse. The atmosphere in my family shifted from a cold war of strategic silence to a tense strategic surveillance operation. Chloe's discovery had lit a fuse, and I could feel the change in every attempted interaction. The silence was replaced by a barrage of probing, clumsily executed intelligence-gathering missions. There were casual-sounding texts from my mom asking for photos of my new apartment, and awkward phone calls from my dad wanting to discuss financial planning for the unemployed creative, a topic he had never shown the slightest interest in before. Ben even sent a text asking if I wanted to hang out and catch a game, an invitation so out of character it was laughable. It was a coordinated, poorly disguised effort, clearly masterminded by Chloe, to get me to crack to admit the truth they were now beginning to suspect was real. Their objective had shifted. They no longer wanted to mock my delusion. They wanted to confirm my fortune. They didn't want to celebrate with me. They wanted to stake their claim. The invisibility cloak was gone, replaced by a glaring, invasive spotlight. The inevitable breaking point came, as it so often did in my family during a holiday. Thanksgiving. The one day of the year where ignoring a family summons was a cardinal sin, an act of familial treason. This year, the grim festivities were being held at Chloe and her husband David's sterile, architectural, digest-worthy mansion. The moment I walked through the massive, pivoting front door, I felt less like a family member and more like a person of interest being brought in for questioning. David, a cardiac surgeon who usually treated me with a polite but distinct professional aloofness, greeted me with an overly friendly handshake and an arm around my shoulder. My dad cornered me by the wine bar, trying to engage me in a conversation about the stock market, dropping names of investment firms and talking about capital gains with a forced nonchalance. Ben, who was clearly back in everyone's good graces after his misunderstanding, hovered nearby, his eyes filled with a greedy, calculating curiosity that he barely bothered to hide. They were all playing a part, and they were all terrible actors. We sat down for dinner at their massive dining table, a single slab of polished concrete that could have seated 20. The turkey was perfectly roasted, the side dishes were gourmet, and the tension was thick enough to carve with a knife. For a while, the conversation was painfully polite. A brittle latticework of small talk about the weather traffic and David's latest medical conference in Hawaii. Then, as dessert, a deconstructed pumpkin pie that looked more like a science experiment was being served. Chloe made her move. She set her fork down with a delicate, deliberate clink that silenced the table. "So, Leo," she began, her voice smooth as silk, "we're all a bit worried about you." "Are you?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. I took a sip of my wine, letting the silence hang in the air for a moment. "That's a new development. I'm doing better than I ever have in my life." That's precisely what worries us, my father chimed in, his voice taking on that familiar lecturing tone he used when he was about to explain my own life to me. You quit a perfectly good job you're living off. Well, frankly, we don't know what you're living off of, and you've been incredibly secretive and hostile. It's not healthy behavior. I think what your father is trying to say, my mom added, her voice trembling slightly. Always the reluctant accomplice in these ambushes is that we're your family. You're supposed to share things with us. Good things and bad things. We're a team. A team, is that right? I said, looking slowly around the table, meeting each of their gazes. Because when I tried to share my good news, you called me a liar, a fool, and a scam victim. When Ben was in desperate trouble, you all condemned me for not destroying my own finances to enable his latest disaster. It seems to me that sharing on this team only works one way. My resources are the team's resources, but my problems are my own. Your problems, however, are also my problems. That's not fair, my mom protested, her eyes welling up with the tears that were her primary defense mechanism. We were just concerned. We didn't want you to get hurt. No, you were dismissive, I stated plainly, my voice level and clear, stripped of the usual accommodating warmth. The years of swallowing my own feelings, of choking down my truth to keep the peace, were over. You couldn't imagine me being successful or fortunate on my own terms, so you rejected the very idea out of hand. But now I looked directly at Chloe, whose face had become a mask of cold fury. Now that you've done some digging and suspect the money might be real, the concern has a very different flavor, doesn't it? It's not concern for my well-being. It's a concern for your potential piece of the pie. A shocked, frigid silence fell over the table. Chloe's mask of sisterly concern dropped to reveal the cold, calculating lawyer beneath. That is a disgusting and baseless accusation, she said, her voice dangerously low and steady. Is it? I challenged, leaning forward for the first time. Then tell me, Chloe, why were you running public record searches on my apartment? Why were you researching the obituaries of wealthy strangers in the Wall Street Journal? Was it to make sure I was okay, or was it to verify a number, you ungrateful, selfish brat? My father suddenly exploded, slamming his hand on the concrete table with a crack that made the silverware jump. After everything we have done for you, everything you've done for me, I stood up my chair, scraping harshly against the polished floor. The calm I had maintained for weeks finally broke, and a torrent of words, decades of suppressed frustration and resentment, came pouring out. Let's talk about what you've done. You've taught me that my only value is what I can provide. You, I pointed my finger at my father, have lectured me my entire life on financial responsibility, while simultaneously expecting me to be the family's irresponsible, no-limit emergency fund. You, I turn to, my mom, have told me my entire life to be the bigger person, which was just code for let your siblings walk all over you because keeping the peace is more important than your self-respect. You, my gaze fell on, Chloe, have never seen me as anything more than your screw-up little brother. A convenient, low-hanging benchmark to make your own calculated success seem even brighter. And you, I finished, my eyes locking on Ben, who now looked pale and terrified. You have used my love as a weapon against me your entire life, mistaking my generosity for a limitless line of credit. You don't know the first thing about me. None of you do. I was breathing heavily, my heart hammering in my chest. The entire table stared at me, stunned into a complete, uncomprehending silence. I had never spoken to them like this before. The reliable, quiet, accommodating Leo was gone. In his place was a stranger, and they were utterly terrified of him. You want to know the truth, I said, my voice dropping to an intense, almost whisper that was more menacing than my shouting had been. Fine. The truth is, it's all real. A kind man named Arthur Pendleton left me $12.4 million, and it is the best and the worst thing that has ever happened to me. It's the best because it gave me the freedom to finally escape this toxic, soul-sucking dynamic. And it's the worst, because it has revealed the ugly, greedy, undeniable truth of what this family really is. You're not a family. You're a collection of individuals bound by obligation and a shared, deeply corrosive sense of entitlement. I looked from one shocked, frozen face to another. There was no joy for me, no relief, no happiness, just stunned, avaricious calculation. I could literally see the wheels turning in their heads, the mental spreadsheets being recalibrated, their entire perception of me being rewritten in real time. I was no longer Leo the failure. I was Leo the lottery ticket. "Don't bother calling me," I said, my voice cold and final. I threw my napkin down on the table. It landed next to the deconstructed pie. "Don't text. Don't send emissaries. When you are ready to see me as a person, as your son, as your brother, and not as a walking, talking bank account, you know where to find me. But I'm not holding my breath." I turned and walked out of the dining room, my footsteps echoing in the cavernous, silent house. I walked out of the pristine, soulless mansion and into the cold, clean November night. I didn't look back. The bridges were not just burned, they were obliterated, turned to ash. I was completely and utterly alone, and for the first time in my entire life, I felt truly, magnificently, and terrifyingly free. The confrontation was over, but I knew the fallout was just beginning, and I had a fortune to protect not just from them, but from the weak, accommodating man I used to be. Walking away from that Thanksgiving dinner felt like stepping out of a burning building into clean, cold air. The air outside was sharp and crisp, and it filled my lungs with a sense of shocking, exhilarating finality. The adrenaline from the confrontation coursed through me, a buzzing electric current, but underneath it was a deep, profound sense of peace. I hadn't planned to detonate a nuclear bomb in the middle of my family's life. But the truth, once uncorked after decades of fermentation, had a violent, explosive momentum all its own. For the first time, I hadn't managed their feelings, absorbed their criticisms, or placated their egos. I had simply spoken my truth, and the truth had set me free. But it had also left me in a vacuum, a silent, empty space where a family used to be. In the days that followed, the silence from my family was different. It was no longer a strategic freeze-out intended to manipulate me. It was the stunned, shell-shocked silence of an army in full disorganized retreat, regrouping to plan its next line of attack. I knew it wouldn't last. Their shock would soon curdle into a potent, toxic cocktail of wounded pride, righteous indignation, and raw, unadulterated entitlement. I needed a plan. Not just a financial plan to protect the money, but a life plan to give it meaning. Arthur hadn't just given me wealth. He had given me a solemn responsibility to not let his fortune become a monument to failure, as he had so heartbreakingly called his own. I had to build something with it, something that would last. My first call the morning after Thanksgiving was to Mr. Davies. I told him everything that had happened, the words pouring out of me in a torrent of relief and exhaustion. He listened patiently, his calm, steady voice, a soothing balm on my frayed nerves. "I am sorry you had to go through that, Leo," he said when I had finished. "But in a way, it was inevitable. Money on this scale doesn't create character. It reveals it with an often brutal clarity. Now let's talk about fortifying your position. The next stage will not be emotional. It will be legal." We spent the next week working with a team. He assembled a bulldog of a trust lawyer, a discreet forensic accountant, and a security consultant who spoke in hushed, serious tones about things like digital privacy and personal liability. It felt absurd, like something out of a spy movie, but Mr. Davies assured me the threats were real. We restructured the trust, adding layers of legal protection and ironclad clauses that would make it virtually impossible for anyone to stake a claim based on familial ties or accusations of undue influence. We were building a fortress not of bricks and mortar, but of airtight legal and financial strategy. While the fortress was being built, I focused on the future. What was I going to do with this life Arthur had given me? The answer, I realized, had been in his journals all along, a quiet but persistent theme. His son Thomas was an artist. His dream had been stifled by his father's well-intentioned but misguided practicality. My own creative spark had been dimmed by the same societal and familial pressures. It felt like a calling, a way to honor both Thomas's memory and my own rediscovered passion. I wasn't just going to dabble in art as a rich man's hobby. I was going to build something meaningful. I spent the next month in a whirlwind of focused, energized activity. I spent hours in libraries and online researching nonprofits, foundations, and community art programs. I drafted business plans, mission statements, and budgets. I talked to people, gallery owners, art teachers, social workers, community organizers. My idea began to take shape, solidifying from a vague dream into a concrete plan, a foundation. The Pendleton Maxwell Foundation. Its mission would be twofold. First, it would provide substantial, no-strings-attached grants to young emerging artists in the Pacific Northwest, painters, sculptors, photographers, digital artists who were struggling to make a living. It would be the kind of foundational support Thomas had never had, giving them the freedom to create without the crushing weight of financial instability. Second, it would fund and operate a large state-of-the-art community art center in an underserved Seattle neighborhood. It would be a safe, inspiring, and beautiful space offering free classes and studio access for children, teenagers, adults, and seniors. It would be a place where creativity wasn't a luxury but a fundamental, accessible part of the community. The project consumed me. For the first time in my professional life, I wasn't just executing someone else's vision. I was building my own from the ground up. I felt an energy, a passion I hadn't felt since I was a teenager. I leased a beautiful old brick building near my loft, a former textile factory with incredible bones and amazing light, and hired a team of architects, real architects, not just assistants, to help me design the space. I pored over grant applications from aspiring artists, their stories and their work filling me with awe and purpose. I interviewed potential instructors looking for people with not just talent, but with a real heart for teaching. The work was demanding, more challenging than anything I had ever done, but it filled me with a sense of purpose that was more valuable than any dollar amount in my trust. I was taking Arthur's gift, a fortune born from his deep regret, and transforming it into a legacy of opportunity and hope. I was creating something that would honor the son he had lost, and the man he had hoped I could become. During this intense period of creation, I also realized how deeply lonely I was. I had my team of professional advisors, but I had no one to share the small victories with, no one to bounce a crazy idea off of at midnight, no one who knew the before Leo and could appreciate the after. The only person I could think of was my old college friend Sarah. We had been inseparable and art school partners in crime and creativity, but had drifted apart as my family's demands and my soul-crushing work schedule consumed my life. I found her on social media. She was a social worker running a youth outreach program for at-risk teens. It felt like a sign from the universe. I sent her a message, my heart pounding with a mixture of hope and fear, and asked if she would be willing to meet for coffee to talk about a project I was working on. We met at a small independent coffee shop, the kind of place with mismatched furniture and local art on the walls. Seeing her was like a breath of fresh air. She had the same warm smile and kind, intelligent eyes I remembered. I didn't tell her everything at first. I just told her I had come into some resources and was starting a nonprofit community art center. Her face lit up with a genuine, unforced enthusiasm. "Leo, that's amazing. That's exactly what this city needs." We talked for hours, the lost years melting away. I found myself telling her about the pressure from my family, about feeling invisible, about my rediscovered love for painting. She listened with a deep, active empathy that I hadn't experienced in years. She didn't judge or offer platitudes. She just understood. By the end of our second coffee, I knew I had to tell her the whole insane story. I took a deep breath and laid it all out: the park bench Arthur, the $12 million, my family's reaction, the Thanksgiving showdown. She listened in stunned, wide-eyed silence. When I finished, she just shook her head slowly. "Wow, Leo," she whispered. "That's a lot." She reached across the table and put her hand on mine. "But I'm not surprised they reacted that way. I remember how they used to treat you back in college. I'm just so sorry you had to go through all of that alone." In that moment, I felt a connection, a sense of being truly seen that I hadn't felt since reading Arthur's letter. "I have a crazy idea," I said, my heart in my throat. "I need an executive director for this foundation. Someone who understands the nonprofit world, who has a heart for this kind of work, and who I can trust completely. Someone who knew me when I was just Leo." Sarah's eyes widened. "Leo, are you offering me a job? I'm offering you a partnership," I corrected. "Let's build this thing together." A slow, brilliant smile spread across her face. "Okay, Maxwell," she said, squeezing my hand. "You're on." As I walked home that day, the Seattle sky seemed a little less gray. I had a fortress to protect my wealth, a foundation to give it purpose, and now a friend to share the journey with. I was building a new life, brick by brick, but I knew the ghosts of my old life were not gone for good. The family was regrouping, and their silence was about to end. I didn't know when or how they would strike, but I knew it was coming. And this time I would be ready. The first volley from my family came not as an angry phone call, but as a thick, formal envelope delivered by courier. It was from a law firm I didn't recognize, and I knew instantly it was Chloe's doing. The letter inside was a petition to the court to establish a conservatorship over me. It painted me as mentally unstable, citing my erratic behavior, quitting my job, buying an expensive loft, and cutting off my concerned family. My refusal to give Ben the $20,000 was framed as proof I was incapable of managing my own affairs. They were trying to have me declared legally incompetent so my father could be appointed to control my assets. The audacity was breathtaking. The family who called me a liar for inventing a fortune was now trying to steal that fortune by claiming I was too crazy to possess it. I immediately called Mr. Davies, who was furious but not surprised. "This is a despicable abuse of the system, Leo," he said, "but we will dismantle it." The legal battle was swift and brutal. Mr. Davies's team was magnificent. They deposed my family one by one, and under his calm, relentless questioning, their narrative crumbled. He produced Ben's bank records, proving the loan shark story was a lie to cover gambling debts. He presented Chloe with a detailed accounting of every dollar I had ever given them over the years, a staggering sum, and asked if those were the actions of an irresponsible person. She had no answer. The court hearing was a formality. The judge, a stern woman who had clearly seen this kind of familial greed, before dismissed the petition in under an hour. "I find this motion to be a predatory and shameful act," she declared, glaring at my family. "This court will not be used as a tool for avarice." Dismissed. As we left the courtroom, my family hurried past their faces, a mixture of shame and defeat. But my mother paused for a moment, her eyes filled with tears. "Leo," she whispered, "I'm so sorry." Before I could respond, my father grabbed her arm and pulled her away. The legal war was over. They had thrown their most powerful weapon at me, and it had failed. They had no moves left. A year later, I stood on the mezzanine of the newly opened Pendleton Maxwell Center for the Arts. The old factory was alive with light color and the joyful noise of creation. Below, a gallery showcased the work of our foundation's first grant recipients, and a children's painting class was in full swing. Arthur's legacy wasn't a number in a bank account. It was this living, breathing place of hope and opportunity. My life was unrecognizable. I ran the foundation alongside Sarah, our friendship, a true partnership. My loft had become a home filled with my own artwork. My relationship with my family remained fractured but changed. After the humiliation in court, they had splintered. I heard my father and Chloe were barely speaking. Ben was still Ben, but he no longer asked me for money. The biggest change was with my mother. A few weeks after the court case, she had come to me alone, offering a raw, honest apology for her weakness and her silence. We began to rebuild, slowly, cautiously, meeting for coffee and getting to know each other not as mother and fixer, but as two adults. It was fragile, but it was real. One afternoon I found myself back at that same park bench where it all began. I poured a cup of coffee from my thermos and placed it on the empty space beside me. "Hello, Arthur," I said quietly. "I hope you'd be proud." I told him about the foundation, about the young artists we were helping, about Sarah, and about my mother. I told him his gift had freed me to become the person I was always meant to be. As I sat there, a young, exhausted-looking architectural student sat at the other end of the bench and began to sketch. We started talking, and I saw a reflection of my younger self in him, talented, passionate, and overwhelmed. Before I left, I told him about the foundation. "You should look us up," I said. "We give out grants to help young artists. It's called the Pendleton Maxwell Foundation." A look of disbelief and hope dawned on his face. As I walked away, I felt a profound sense of peace. The cycle was complete. Arthur's quiet kindness to a stranger had become my own. My family had called me a liar, and in a way they were right. The story was never really about the $12 million. It was about inheriting a second chance at life and finally learning how to be worthy of it.